Thank you for joining me today on the Who God Says podcast. I am your host and Kingdom Ambassador, Ty Chandra. Hi, hi, hi. Today we have a special guest joining us. He is a pastor, a husband, a father, and also a podcast host. He's the host of Where Did You See God podcast and an ambassador of Christ, Pastor Paul Granger. Welcome.
It's great to be here. I'm
How
excited for
are
our
you
conversation.
today?
I'm doing great. I'm here. And, these kind of conversations, I always find them really life-giving. So this is a highlight of my day.
Awesome. I'm so glad you're here. I'm really excited. Like I told you, I giggle a lot when I'm excited. So um, hopefully I can hold it in so that people can hear
Mhm.
you and get this good word from God. So today we're going to be talking about the power to persevere. And you wrote two books that kind of caught my eye. I know you have, I think about 8 or 9 of them. How many do you have?
I don't know. I got kind of crazy this summer. So I've been self-publishing on Amazon, and it's so easy that I probably did more than I should. No, I'm joking. uh, but I wrote 4 this summer, and then there was 3 devotionals that were already written that I threw up there, and then one more bonus one on Revelation that was a year ago. So,
Yeah,
just been kind of writing a lot.
that's awesome. That's awesome. When he give you the words to share, you got to
It's
share the
true.
words.
And that's probably the better thing people need to know is it's my hope is it's God doing the writing, not so much me. My fingers are on the keyboard, but my hope is
Yeah.
this book is mostly the Spirit's guidance.
Yes. So the two that really stood out to me was I've had enough, Lord,
Hmm.
how to persevere when you have nothing left to give, which is
Mhm.
really kind of inspired the title of the show today. And then I saw God won't provide. The lie we don't believe we are believing.
Mhm.
That one was mind blowing. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Hit the people right
Okay.
from the title.
Yes. Okay. So, yeah, right in the forehead. That one, I was like, oh, hmm.
Mhm.
So, where did the inspiration come from? I know you said you want to feel like, hopefully, it's God
Mhm.
coming through, but was it anything in your life that you were dealing with that you said, hey, this is something I need to share? Where did the
Yeah.
inspiration come from for those two titles?
Yeah, it's always interesting where these things come from. The one that I just released yesterday, it's called Stinky Feet, Loving Beyond Our Senses. That one was a really random, crazy one because I woke up at 1 a.m. in the morning and I felt like I just immediately had like the first 6 chapters in my mind. Now, it's 1 a.m. I'm tired. So I just get my phone, I type it out, and then I go back to bed and I come
Yes.
back to it. And then over the past month, God has just been working what that needed to look like. But the I've had enough book. That one, there's been we all have hard seasons in life.
Yes.
And at that particular time, I was working through something that it was just a really hard, frustrating point where in my humanity I might want to get hopeless, but I had seen God work enough that I knew he was still present and active. But I'm like, God, I'm just tired of this. Like I'm just so tired of the same thing over and over. Like God, I have no strength in me. And God brought to mind the story of Elijah.
Mm.
And I couldn't remember exactly what it was. I just remember there's this piece that I was like, I feel like Elijah said something like this. And where it happens is Elijah had been trying to seek and serve God. I mean, he had been going hard on it at a place where nobody else seemed to be doing it. He felt really alone in it, but he was being obedient. He was enduring hardship. He was living for God. And then there was this one point where it was very clear, not just that he was living for God, but that everyone saw that his God was real. And it happened when there were hundreds of these prophets to this false God, Baal.
Mhm.
And basically Elijah was like, all right, you know what? Let's go ahead and see which God is real. what we're going to do is we're going to set up some altars and we're going to have a sacrifice. And whichever God sets their altar on fire, that is the true God. But I'm going to let y'all go first. I'm going to sit back, let y'all do it, and y'all go ahead. And so hundreds of them are like chanting and dancing around and nothing's happening. And Elijah is like, it's hilarious. It's almost like he's taunting them, but in a passive aggressive way. He's like, oh, maybe y'all just need to cry out louder. Maybe your God has gone off and he's relieving himself. Just keep on going. And like they're getting intense with it. They're shouting louder and louder. They start cutting themselves. They're going crazy with trying to call down fire from their God, and nothing happens. And then after hours, Elijah's like, all right, you know what? He kind of dusts himself off, gets up. He's like, hold on a second. Can y'all get some water? Let's pour water on this altar. Go ahead. Now pour so much that it's like making a moat around it. Everything's got to be wet. Yep. All right, great, cool. Okay, God, go ahead. And then God lights it on fire. The water evaporates. Everything that was wet burns up. And it's very clear that God exists. Now, this should have been a triumphant moment where everyone's like, Elijah, we were wrong. You were right. And they set him up in some kind of level of authority and God's blessing him. He's like, thank you for your perseverance, Elijah. You don't have to struggle anymore. That's not what happens. Jezebel sees this. She gets mad that all her prophets were killed and says, may it be unto me if by this day time tomorrow you're not dead. Like, let me be the one. Like just utters this curse that promises that she will not rest until he is dead. And so he runs off and he's running and he's running and he runs until he can't run anymore. And he collapses and God takes care of him, sends an angel to provide, like bake a meal for him. But when Elijah is like in his senses, he basically says, I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I mean, that's the level. This guy who had just saw God at work.
Right.
Like he knows that God is real, but he knows that within himself, there is nothing left. And God meets him in that place and invites him to keep on going. Doesn't take away the hardships, but invites him to keep on going. And so when that passage came to my mind and I read the story and I realized just how intense it was. One, it was encouraging for me in the season that I was in, but then two, I immediately felt like that needs to be a book. And I didn't know what it was going to look like or how it was going to work, but I just started typing. It's like we talked about earlier. Sometimes the Spirit brings things. I'd be going and suddenly I would recognize, oh, wait a minute, if the chapters were this way, or if I did this, like where it landed was I did not have any plan for it at all.
Right.
But what was so beautiful is even if it never got published, it was clear to me that God was using that to help me through my own process. And I feel like that's often how it is with the stuff that he invites us to. I imagine it's the same thing for you in podcasting, that when we're stepping into these places of what God's inviting us to create, it's actually him that's creating, but he might be creating for something beyond a book or a podcast episode. There may be a deep work he's doing in us or those that we're interacting with. So all these titles, I don't want any of them to be some great idea I had. And so far, they're ideas that I didn't have or I wouldn't have chosen, but I was willing to trust God in it. And sometimes it's intimidating. But by the end, it's always very clear that God has done something. And even if I don't know how it's going to play out, I'm excited and grateful that he's invited me into this opportunity for whatever it is he's doing.
That's amazing. I can actually relate to that. This whole podcast was not my idea.
Mm-hmm.
It was not. I did not like being in front of the camera. Yep. I talk to people when I need to talk to people. I did not go out and say, hey, I want to talk to you about this. Like, nope. If I'm at work and you need to talk to me, you can talk to me.
Yeah.
I just was not the person that would go out and talk to people. But no matter where I was, people would always talk to me.
Mm-hmm.
Even in social settings. If I'm at a birthday party and maybe I only know one person at the birthday party because they were the person that invited me, I'm never uncomfortable, but there's always people coming up to me, talking to me. And when I say talking to me, I mean like telling me about their childhood.
Going deep into it.
Right. And it's like, I never, took offense to it or like was standoffish with anybody and like, why are you telling me this? I would always just listen and offer advice, and most of the time give him a hug. And I remember one time I was at a bar and a lady walked past the bar. She was crying, and she walked past about 7 people, and then she walked past me, and I was like, "Are you okay? Do you need a hug?" And she just stopped and turned around, and I hugged her. And everybody looked like, "What is going on?" And so she just started talking to me. She was like, she just got off of work. She broke up with her boyfriend. It was a whole bunch of stuff going on. And I was like, "Do you need a ride home?" And they're like, "You don't even know her."
Yeah.
But I don't run to talk to people. They always come and talk to me. So when the Spirit was telling me about this podcast, I had never even listened to a podcast. I knew about a lot of podcasts, never listened to one, not one. And I was actually up for 3 days straight. I was listening to podcasts, watching podcasts on YouTube, and I had a notebook, and I was writing. I was watching and writing. And I went to sleep. I only had 3 hours of sleep after 3 days. And when I got up, because I had to go to work, and I was like, I was writing stuff down. What did I do with the notebook? I looked at the notebook, and there was everything there. The name of the podcast, the concept, the outline, everything was there. And I'm like, what is this? Then I started Googling, like, how do you start a podcast?
I guess I'm doing this now. Yeah. Well, and see, this is the wild thing is, when you talk about this idea of the power to persevere, a lot of times in our minds, the framework we have without acknowledging it is that we want to persevere in a place where we want to be.
Right.
That's the place that we want to persevere.
Right.
Anywhere else, like, we don't want to persevere. We want to get out of it. And what you and I are talking about is the reality that God often invites us into places that we wouldn't have chosen or we wouldn't want to be. And he's not doing it because he's cruel or he's testing us or anything like that. It's actually because he knows abundantly more. He knows that he's trying to accomplish something greater than what we're trying to accomplish, which is our security or our comfort or our reputation or wealth or power or control. Like, there's a whole list of things that are actually our pursuits that actually come before God in our hearts. And meanwhile, God's pursuit is love. His desire is for love for us, but also for those around us, for those that will come after us. And so part of this power to persevere comes from a willingness to be wherever God invites us to be, even if it's not what we would choose, and even if it's not what we want, and even if it seems like an awful place, like an irredeemable place. And so, like, even in what I was talking about earlier, the situation that I was in, that was just so deeply hard, I was saying, I have had enough. One, I also still knew that it was a space that God had invited me to and was inviting me to remain in. And that's the hard one. Sometimes we can recognize God invited us to a place, but when he says, and I'd like you to stay there, and I'm not promising it'll get better. It might get worse. Like, we're like, then why am I here? But when we have that deeper sense that maybe God's trying to accomplish something, and that our willingness to endure, our willingness to persevere allows God's love to flow through us in places that it might not have flowed otherwise. Your willingness to give a hug when everyone else did the human logic thing. I don't know this woman. I don't know her situation. So, like, I'm not going to turn and hug a stranger. And this woman might not want, a hug. And what if then she just wanted to talk to me and I lose all my whole night? It's like, you were willing to, like, respond to that little sense. Right. And so, this is something when I was the last formal job that I had was one of those situations where I was trying to step in obedience to honor and seek God. And then suddenly things got really bad. The environment at times was toxic. There were a lot of false things being portrayed and conveyed about me, expectations that weren't realistic. I mean, it was the type of environment that my closest friends were saying, you need to leave. Like, you need to leave. Like, you can't stay in that space. And I wanted to leave. I started a job search. And then I felt like God was saying, hey, Paul, I want to invite you to stay, and I'm not promising it'll get better. And when you get that, you have to decide what is more important. Is God more important, or is everything else that makes sense more important? Because it makes more sense for me to not be misrepresented by my boss. It makes more sense for me to have a job that's sustainable. It makes more sense for me to be happy, to be comfortable. That makes more sense. It does not make sense to endure hardship simply because I feel like God wants me to. Like, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
The wisdom of God is foolishness to man. And so fortunately, there is enough spiritual maturity in me to be willing to step into that. Now, that doesn't mean that then I was like a saint in those places and like all holy and with peace and all that. I still struggled. I was like, all right, God, I did it. Now are things going to get better? And then when they get worse, like I'd forget that God told me they might get worse. And when I would hit another point where I'm like, all right, God, well, I persevered. And so now, like, can I go now? And I would feel like God would say, I want to invite you to stay, and I'm not promising it'll get better. But each time I would grow in spiritual maturity and trusting, okay, like each step of obedience deepens our resolve to trust God. But there's still this element that Jesus invites us to, which is to die to everything else, to die to self. Because the problem is, as long as those things are still alive, they will eventually turn our eyes again towards them more and more. And so that idea of being perceived accurately, like, was drawing like, Paul, don't you want people to see you accurately? Don't you want them to not say these false things about you? And so I'd be looking at God, but then suddenly looking like, oh man, I really would like for my boss to understand me correctly. I really would like this space to not be so painful. I really would. And slowly my eyes would turn and I would still be seeking God, but I would be seeking God because I would want him to fix those things.
Yes.
And meanwhile, God's like, those things don't even matter. Like, you're asking me to fix something that doesn't matter. It's like when Jesus would go to heal, he didn't heal everybody he encountered. And when he did heal people, what he was cognizant of is that that wasn't actually the important healing. He knew their bodies were eventually going to break and die. So he was after their eternal life. My favorite healing is the one where he said to the guy, and I believe it was the guy being brought down through the roof, it was clear what he wanted healing for. It was clear what his friends wanted him to be healed for. It's clear to everybody watching, this guy can't walk, so that's what he needs to be healed for. And what does God do? He heals his spiritual body. He says your sins are forgiven, and doesn't and stops there. And it's only when the Pharisees start to grumble that he's like, oh, okay, I see y'all think y'all know better than me about who my father is and what he's actually here to do. So, all right, since you're questioning all this, hey, can you go ahead and pick up your mat and start walking? That's when he did the physical healing. But the physical healing was secondary. My job being sustainable or comfortable, my reputation being intact, me having happiness, like, those were secondary things. God was actually trying to accomplish something abundantly more than I was asking or imagining for. You know, Ephesians 3:20. And so finally, when I got to a place where I was like, kind of like that Elijah place, I hit this point of hopelessness where I'm like, God, it's clear that there's absolutely nothing I can do to make my boss see me correctly, to be treated fairly and justly, to be able to live into this role that I feel like I could serve you in well. Like, I've done everything I can. There's literally nothing more I can do. And it was like I was saying, yep. Like, it was never about you doing these things. It was about you just trusting and seeking me. And so I want to invite you to continue to do that. And I'm not promising it'll get better. And the big shift came when I realized maybe I need to release my hope that my expectation that things will be good when the job is good. Maybe I need to embrace the reality that I could actually, like the Apostle Paul, be content in any and every situation. That actually I could find joy and contentment and peace, even if things get horrendously worse, even if I'm fired. Like, that's actually possible in God's kingdom, in God's reality. And when I embrace that, when I embrace the reality that my job wasn't working for this guy in this place, that my job was working for God as an ambassador of Christ, suddenly I was like, oh, like, actually, it doesn't matter what my job responsibilities are. It doesn't matter how my boss sees me, because my real boss, God, I know how he sees me. Right. And the stuff he's calling me to, I can do that whether or not anyone else approves of it and whether or not I get paid. And I found this peace that defied understanding in that place. things got harder, uh, things got worse, and then my job was taken unjustly. I was never given an actual reason. All that I was told was, we just don't think you're a good fit. I'd been there for over 5 years, and there had been some really respected voices that affirmed that I was actually a really good fit. Uh, I should have been on a human level just livid, but God had prepared me to instead be loving. And I was able to enter that meeting with a level of peace and even joy that as my job was being taken unjustly, God prompted me to actually pray for those guys, to encourage them, to leave, go home smiling. My wife's like, "What is wrong with you? Why are you laughing right now? You just got fired for no reason." I'm like, "Because God's good." Like, I don't know if I said that, but that's how I was feeling, is it was so clear that God was working. So when it comes to perseverance, our barrier to that is so often our own minds, our own hopes, our own plans, our own expectations, or put another way, our lack of trust in God's mind, in God's ways, in his wisdom, in his plans, in what he's accomplishing. And it's understandable because often what he's accomplishing is bigger than us, and what we're after is about our lives here and now. And releasing that, that's sometimes a lifelong journey.
Yeah, that's awesome. You brought up a great point about it really being about ourselves. A lot of times when people are thinking about the storms that they go through,
Mm-hmm.
it's more of maybe they had a plan and it didn't happen the way they wanted it,
Yeah.
and now it's hard. But
Mm-hmm.
it may have been that it was going to be hard anyway.
Yeah.
You know, it was going to be
Mm-hmm.
hard anyway. But when that plan didn't work, what did you rely on? Or what did you rely
Mm-hmm.
on first before you put the plan together?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's how I kind of look at it when I
Yeah.
think about persevering and going through things. Um, when I was younger, I didn't plan for anything. I just let things happen.
Yeah.
But as I
Yeah.
got older and started, getting into business and everything, you have to make a plan, right? That's the first thing you do. You make a business plan. So when I started to make plans and they not happen the way I wanted it to happen, I would
Mm-hmm.
fall back into, see, this is why I don't expect nothing.
Right.
This is why I shouldn't even I shouldn't even made a
Yeah.
business plan. I should have just wrote some words down and gave it to the banker and that be that.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time I didn't trust God to
Yeah.
have him involved in those plans in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And when things started to change, and it's like, okay, that didn't happen like I wanted to happen. This is
Yeah.
not happening like I wanted to happen. Instead of reverting back to this is why I don't expect anything,
Mm-hmm.
my mindset had to be changed into, even though the plans are not going the way I wanted them to go, maybe they're going the way God wanted them to go. So
Yeah.
let's see where you're
Yeah.
bringing me, God.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
took a lot for me to get there.
Yeah. And like our problem is I mean, we mean well, but oftentimes we're trying to take spiritual wisdom and human wisdom and mush them together. And we want
Right.
God to be a part of all of it, but also like we know how the world works and we know how things function. And that's, that other book, God Won't Provide, the lie we don't believe we're believing, is like we on Sunday we'll say, yeah, God's provider, God's got me, but then we live our lives as though it's not true. Yeah, God's got
Right.
me, but I have to get money, because if I don't have money, I'll lose my house. And so yes, I mean, I want to serve God, but I have to. No, you don't have to do this, that, or the other, because you don't need money. You need God.
That's
Like,
right.
God is the provider. But in this world, money is how you pay for things. And so there's this tension, right? Of how do we hold to the spiritual truths that actually can look like foolishness, and be aware of the human realities that we may have to function in those rules, but we are in and not of the world. Like, we are not bound to those rules. So Jesus sometimes paid the taxes, that when they were walking in, there was a time that they paid the taxes. He didn't have to, as the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
But he chose to demonstrate that even in the moments where we're living within the constructs, there can still be a spiritual reality, which is, in that case, one of the disciples was like, we have to pay this tax. We don't have the money. He's like, oh, can you go over to that fish and reach in its mouth, and pulled out the money, right? Like, God can provide. But often we are so caught up in our human thinking. And so when you're talking about planning, sometimes people fall on two ends of the spectrum that misses the point. And you basically hit it so well. Is on one end, there are people that are hyper focused on planning because they want to control what will happen. What we all know, especially after a global pandemic, is there's very little we can actually control with 100% certainty. Like, so little. And so that isn't an infallible approach. And then there are other people who just kind of toss it up and say, whatever happens, happens. But what we also know is sometimes if you don't have intentionality, you can miss opportunities or miss things that God's inviting us to. So what is that tension in the middle? And Jesus talks about it. He talks about how we need to count the cost. And I feel like this is a passage we miss the deeper point of. But he goes in, starts off with human logic. Now, if you're going to go build a tower, like you got to count the cost. You got to make sure you've got enough money to get all the lumber you need and you have all the materials. Because if you don't, then you're going to start something you can't finish.
Right.
Or if you're a king and there's an army coming against you, you got to count the cost. See how many troops you have. Do you have enough troops to win? If you don't have enough troops, if you're outnumbered, then you send a delegation, try to work out terms for peace. But like, you just don't go in there because you'll lose. Like, he's basically saying, like, this is how we think about things. And probably everyone's nodding like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, you count the cost, do your due diligence, this, that, and the other.
Right.
Then Jesus throws a curveball at them, and he's talking to his disciples, and he says, in the same way, like, I've invited you to something that's going to cost you everything. It's going to cost you your life. In fact, the cost is too much. It is literally too much for you. So you want to follow me? Right? He just spelt out this logic that if the cost is too much, then you got to change plans and go somewhere else. You'll end up being like the people in John 6:66 who were following Jesus. Then Jesus starts saying some crazy stuff and they're like, we're out. Like, we're turning away.
Right.
Like, Jesus, like, are you willing for the cost to be too much and to still say yes? Are you willing to die to everything, even to self, because of you want to follow me? And we see this logic, this reality working out because Gideon was struggling with the same things that we've been talking about. God comes up to Gideon and says, hey, I want to invite you into this hard situation. And Gideon's like, you got the wrong guy. I'm the least of my family, the least of my clan and tribe. Like, I'm the least of the least of the least of the least. And you're telling me you want me to do what? Like, lead an army? Like, no, like, I'm not your guy. So part of his perseverance was understanding identity, that his identity wasn't least of the least of the least. Like, that was maybe his circumstances, his situation. His identity was someone called by God. And the reality is, those that God calls, it's not about their capacity. It's about God's capacity through them. In fact, that's why God often chooses the least of these, because then at the end of it, everyone looks and says, well, I know it wasn't Gideon that did that, because I know Gideon. They did the same thing to Jesus. They're like, wait, Jesus, this is the carpenter's son, right? Wasn't his mom unfaithful because she was pregnant before they were married? And isn't he just, like, I played games with him. He's just some guy. Like, and he's saying he's the son of God. Like, this is how we think. So it's identity as a piece of it. But then when Gideon gets in there, this is where you see that count the cost if a king's going to war thing, because he comes in, he's like, all right, I've got 32,000 people and let me look. Oh, there's multiple armies and I can't even count them. Like, it says the number of camels alone were like the grains of sand on the sea. And so they already didn't have enough. So human logic says you don't have enough. You either work out terms of peace or you get out of there. God said, hey, you got too many people. Like, the opposite. No, we don't have enough. No, you got too many people. See who's afraid and tell them they can go home. And no shame, you can just go. So 22,000 were a little too afraid, understandably so, justifiably so, and they left. 10,000 were left. All right, so now they definitely don't have enough people. They got brave people, but not enough people. And God's like, yeah. I'm going to have to ask you to cut that down even more. And what he says is, if there were enough, then at the end of it, people would say, oh, look what Israel did. Like, Israel conquered that army. Yeah, go guys. You did a good job. He's like, but I want them to understand that it's not about their might or power. It's about my love for them. I want them to understand who I am, because that is going to shape how they can find full life, not their own strength that will eventually fail. So take them to the water and look at how they drink. And everyone who laps like a dog, that's your crew. So now Gideon is left with 300 people that lap like a dog. I don't even know why that was the parameter, but that's what God chose. That's who he has. But even in that, like when we're talking about perseverance, we can look at Gideon and think, oh, he must have been hyper spiritual. No, Gideon was still wrestling with fear. And what God says to him is, hey, if you're still afraid, here's what I want you to do. Go down to the camp and eavesdrop at one of the tents and just listen. That's all God tells him. So Gideon goes down and he hears somebody recounting a dream of some thing falling down the hill into their camp and this, that, and the other. And it becomes very clear to Gideon that that dream was God's gift to him to say, you are going to be victorious. So they set up this weird plan where they encircle, the 300 of them encircle this innumerable number of enemy troops. They have a torch and a trumpet, and they're supposed to like blow the trumpet and throw the torch, and a plan that really shouldn't have worked. And functionally, in and of itself, it didn't. Because what actually worked is that when that moment came, God threw the army into such confusion that they started fighting each other. So that here are the 300 Israelites have now defeated this army, and they really didn't have to do much of anything. The perseverance was knowing who they were, who God had called them to be, knowing what God was inviting them to, and then just being obedient, even if it looked like the most foolish thing in the world. And so if they can do that, where their lives were actually at stake, why is it so hard for us when it's like small stuff, like, you know, something with a friend or a job or this, that, or the other? Like, we struggle in even the smallest ways to trust God at that level. And I think what we forget is you don't have to be super spiritual to trust God at that level. Sometimes it's just stepping. It's like, okay, I'll put it this way. Have you ever been bungee jumping?
Oh, no.
I haven't either, right? But I love your reaction because it's perfect for this analogy, because if you were up there on the stand, that's what you would be saying is like, oh no, I don't know how you convinced me to come up here, but I'm not doing that because you're telling me that this little thin rope is going to keep me from dying. Like, I know what happens if somebody falls from this height, and I know what happens if this rope, and you can't guarantee with 100% certainty, right? And so that's the reality. If somebody bungee jumps, if somebody jumps out of a plane, right? Like, you could have all the safety parameters in place, but there is no way for you to have 100% certainty because ropes can fail. Parachutes have failed. Like, things can happen. And so anybody who does that has to take a like literal step of faith.
Yes.
In this case, they're having faith in a rope, in a parachute, but they step even though they don't know for sure. It is not total confidence. And there are some people, and you would be in this situation if you ended up stepping, you would probably like still be going, I don't know, go. And you would make yourself go forward, even though everything in you is screaming no. It is that decision to move forward, even though you don't want to. That doesn't take confidence. That doesn't take like strength. Sometimes it's even the weakness that allows us to do it, because like there is something beyond our understanding that is making us go. And with God, like he actually is 100% certain. We don't always see it or believe it because the ways that we expect him to show that, he doesn't do it. And then we're like, well, God didn't show up. God's like, well, that's because I didn't tell you I was going to show up in that way. But sure, if you want to put that on me, like, fine. But like, he is like faithful, like the quintessence of faithfulness and love, and is reliable. It's just that what he is inviting us to rely on him on may be different than what we want. So are we willing to step, even if it doesn't make sense? And the more we do that, the easier it gets. But I think it's still a lifetime of growing in that ability.
Yes, it is.
Hi, everyone. Join the Kingdom Fanatics community. Get exclusive content, green room access with our guests, and more. Visit our website at whogodsays.com. Like and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We greatly appreciate your love and support. To find all information on joining our community, being a guest on the show, donating on our PayPal donation page, and more. Visit us at whogodsays.com. Now back to the show.
Because as Apostle Paul says, no one has arrived. Not even I have arrived. So yeah, we're all going to continue to grow in every aspect of life. Just, we're never too old to grow or to learn. A lot of people feel like they learned enough, but we're never too old.
Yeah.
You had mentioned something about making money, right? So we kind of focus on money because we know we need that in our everyday life. Why do you believe Christians have a misaligned understanding of success?
Yeah. Well, a big part of it is what we see around us and what has just always been. Like, success is you have as little hardship as possible. Success is you have as much as possible. Success is you are perceived as good as possible. And what's hilarious for Christians is we will align with that because it makes sense in the world. It makes sense in our minds, and it feels better. I mean, it feels a lot better to have money in your account than to have none. But what's so strange is then we profess to follow a guy who didn't reflect that, right? Like, what is it? Isaiah, there's a passage that's referencing Jesus that said, I mean, he wasn't even much to look at and people despised him. And, this guy, everyone could look at him and think that, I thought he was a carpenter, but now he's just walking around and teaching. And some people would call him a rabbi, but then they would start to say, ooh, but he's saying some weird stuff. Like, he did not look successful. And in the times where somebody could think that he looked successful, like when hundreds of people were following him, then there are moments where, like, again, in John 6:66, where it's like people just dip because they're like, wait, this guy, I thought he was good, but he's starting to say the crazy stuff. You see moments like the triumphal entry in John 12, where people are actually celebrating in the streets. And then only days later, they're yelling, crucify. Right. So when Jesus's human life ended, he looked like a failure. I mean, very few people were actually there at the foot of the cross to like support him. I mean, a lot of people were hiding in the shadows, if not running away. Some of them, his closest ones, denied or betrayed. I mean, that's not success. He didn't have money left to his name in some account, right, that he passed on. He didn't have all these things, but we can look at scripture and recognize there's a different definition of success for Jesus. That his success actually came from what everyone perceived as failure. Death on the cross was actually one of the most amazing things that happened as a result of his life and for our lives. And so we'll define Jesus as successful in different ways because it's Jesus, but then we won't apply the same things to ourselves. So if hardship exists in our lives, then we're failing. If we don't have the financial security that we want, then we're failing. If we don't have the reputation that we want, if people don't believe us or trust us, then we're failing. And so we will pursue all the ways to not fail. And as a result, end up failing spiritually. And so it's so fortunate for us that Jesus, God, the Spirit, like they have grace for our foolishness, that when we, like Peter, go a different direction, like Jesus was waiting on the shore to restore him. Like God is constantly willing to restore us when we get caught up in our human understanding. But I had to wrestle with this when I lost my job, because when it happened, my wife and I were working at the same ministry. So we're making that ministry income. So we don't have a whole lot of money to start with. You cut that income in half. Ooh, that's hard. You add 2 kids that we already had. Ooh, okay, we got some bills, mortgage, okay, all the other expenses. And my wife was pregnant with a 3rd child. So we had another kid come in and hospital expenses. You know what human logic says is, oh, Paul, you just got your job taken from you. You need to find a new one as soon as possible. You know what God said? Don't operate out of financial fear. That's what he told me. Is whatever decisions I make, what is my basis for it? Is it financial fear? Like, I need money. If I don't have money, well, or is it faith in God, whatever he calls me to do, that I actually trust that God can provide? God invited me to not job search for the first 2 months. That's foolish. That's foolish. For at the time, I was, around 35 or 36 or something. Like I was a little too grown to be acting like that. Yeah, I can't just not get a job. God gave me such a peace. I ended up being unemployed for around 6 months. We had run the numbers of when our existing money would run out. It didn't. And then there were also more expenses on top of it. And we didn't even have to scale back our life. Christmas came. We didn't say, sorry, kids, no gifts this year because daddy doesn't have a job. No, like God said, don't operate out of financial fear. So all the ways that things were supposed to work when it comes to money, it didn't work like that. All the ways that God promises to be faithful, it showed up. Sometimes in like unexpected ways, like checks in the mail that weren't solicited, that covered like exactly the expenses we needed. Like I landed in the hospital for a week and it had some expenses from that. And it didn't drive us down. Like car issues, our cat needed dental surgery, like all these things God somehow provided. Sometimes we don't even know. Like we get to the point where the money was supposed to be gone. And I look at the bank account, I'm like, why is the money not gone? It's not like we had some like clear influx. Like just, the math doesn't make sense. There shouldn't be money here. And there is. Then God invited me to step into a space serving with Youth with a Mission where there's no paycheck. Nobody in Youth with a Mission gets a paycheck. We all trust God for provision. And oftentimes it comes through the generosity of others, but there's no paycheck. I've been serving in that way for 4 years. So for over 5 years, I haven't had a traditional paycheck. The money has never run out. On top of that, there's been abundantly more that's happened. We did a family missions training, and the place where we felt like God was calling us to was Hawaii. I never thought I would even get to visit Hawaii, especially working in ministry, much less live there for 3 months. We did not have the money for it. Everything got paid for. I can tell you how some of it got paid for. Some of it doesn't make sense. We actually got to take our family to Disney. Not something I would have chosen because I'm so frugal. But somehow God provided the money for it. After the trip, we're like, okay, now we're going to be struggling because whatever we had saved is gone now. The money's not gone. Like my wife and I are like, I don't understand. This doesn't make sense. So like we get caught up in this framework of how life works. And yes, life does work that way. Yes, count the cost. If you can't build the tower, if you can't fight the army, yes, that all is actually true. The problem is there is a greater spiritual reality. And all of that human reality, that earthly reality, like that is true, it answers to the spiritual reality, which is why Jesus could say, you know what? Water cannot hold people. Watch this. I'm walking on water, right? Like water can't hold people. You and I could go out and step on water. It will not hold us. But the spiritual reality is God can do whatever and anything. And he chooses in his love and graciousness to do that in our lives. When we are struggling, when we don't know how to move forward, and when we know exactly how things are going to go, God sometimes says, yes, you're right. That is exactly how things are going to go, except that I can do things differently and change the rules if I want. And this is what I want to do in your situation if you trust me. But letting go of what has just been built in us and what we see around us, that is hard. That is hard. And sometimes it takes that bungee jump step of like screaming as we step off because we want to choose to believe even though we don't yet believe.
That's awesome. I had sort of a revelation with my own finances. I would always pray, like going back to the plan. When I did start, I have a tax service, so I started my business completely over. And I was like, I think the element that was missing was that I didn't start with God in mind. So when I started everything over, it wasn't, this is how our daily outlook is going to be for the day. It would be, God, what is our daily outlook for the day? And so when I started really praying about, getting new clients into the tax office and things like that, and I would have like a number of the amount of, okay, I'm an accountant, so I need to have a number of what makes sense to operate the business, right? So I would have a number and I would pray about the number. and just wait and watch to see if I'm going to reach that goal. So at one point, I had a tax office. I also opened up a daiquiri shop, and I actually still had my job, which was I worked for Intuit QuickBooks, and so I had a number for the tax office, had a number for daiquiri shop, and anything that I got from the job would just cover household bills, right? And so I started praying, and I prayed for a good, I think, 7 months. And the number that I prayed for, I surpassed in the tax office. I surpassed in the daiquiri shop. And then I got scared. And so I didn't realize at the time that I got scared. But when not me, but when God set me down and like the daiquiri shop I closed because I had a death in the family. I closed that. The tax office, I just only operated it now. I only operated during tax season. Previously, it was all year round. And when I had that extra time and he sat me down and really started playing things back, it was like rewinding a movie. And he started playing things back. And I said, well, yeah, I prayed for that. I prayed for this. Then this happened. And I immediately remembered when I said, oh, I'm going to have to stop something. And did not realize that I prayed for things. And like I said, he surpassed in the tax office. He surpassed anything that I even thought about. And I instantly thought, oh, I have to cut something down because I didn't have a good, even though I'm in the finance field, I didn't have a good relationship with money because I felt like it had a lot to do with me being a Christian because since I was little, I heard the verse where it says it's hard for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven, right? Yeah. And as a child, I didn't really understand it, but the understanding that I did have, my mindset said, oh, I don't want to be rich. I'm not going to be able to see God if I'm rich. And I took that throughout my whole life. And it took me until I was 36 for me to understand that the riches and even the physical riches were not about me. If I wanted to be a rich person physically, with the monetary and enter the kingdom of heaven, it's because God gave me that for someone else. It's not for me. It's for what he want me to do for the kingdom. And when I got that money and I was like, oh, I'm going to have to stop something. I immediately said I had to stop. I started placing limitations. And when he showed me that, when he rolled it back like I was rewinding a movie, I was like, how in the world can I pray? I want this. I need this. I want to do this for you, God. I want to do this for you. And then have limitations on how he's going to do it. Like that was, once he revealed it to me, it was like,
yeah,
you are crazy. Like, you are absolutely crazy. How can you limit him when you're begging for something? That is crazy. So he kind of really, really dealt with me on that. And it's just been mind blowing. It's been mind blowing for me.
Yeah. And that's, one of the hard things too, because again, you're right. We have our minds set around what we want to happen, what we think should happen, what shouldn't happen, and how it's supposed to happen. And that first step of spiritual growth is getting to a place where you stop limiting God and you start trusting his timing and his ways. But then when we do that, then we hit this next level of spiritual growth, which is really frustrating, which we touched on earlier, which is it's not about us. And so again, our metric would be that if I trust God and God does it in his way and I don't limit him, then the end result is going to be that my business thrives or that I have a comfortable life or that like we still kind of expect that. For me, it was all right, God, I'm trusting you and you tell me to stay in this rough, toxic environment. But the end result is going to be that the job becomes what it should be, what I thought you had said it would be, what really would serve the community best. Like, but God's doing abundantly more than we can ask or imagine, which means he's also doing abundantly more than us, which means the steps of faith, our journey, isn't just about, like, we don't live in silos. It's not just about my life or your life and how God makes that a good story. Like, he is putting us in an interaction with so many people that we are aware of and people that we aren't, clients that are coming in. And in the moments that your life is being shaped by deep spiritual values and truths and foundations, you might not even openly say anything about God or Jesus, but there is something flowing from that, a spirit coming out of that could impact that person, right? Like even that woman walking by at the bar, there is a principle of loving others that was so ingrained in you that that's what your response was out of, even though it was inconveniencing to you. And she was blessed by that. And you probably have no idea what happened in the rest of her life, right? And it could be that God invites us to these places, but even when we sign on that, okay, it's not about me having the money or the reputation of life. Okay, it's about other people. Great. There's another level of spiritual maturity that's even harder than that, which is, but what if it's not just that you aren't successful in your mind, but what if you look like a failure? And so for me, the way it's played out is, when it comes to the podcast, for example, you and I know there are expectations around what a podcast is supposed to be and what success looks like, and how many people are listening, how frequently are they listening for the whole episode? Are you getting monetizations and sponsorships? Like, are you getting, like, that is success. If there's only a few people, and what are you even doing? Like, it's not really a successful podcast. But what you and I also know is, like, how God defines success. Like, neither of us wanted to do our podcast. Neither of us were podcasting people. And God told us to do it. And we're like, God, are you sure? Because I don't really want to put myself out there. But here we are, both experiencing on a regular basis God working through this space. Even if this never becomes an episode, you and I have experienced God in this space. And what we know is that if he becomes an episode, somebody else could, even if we never hear the stories. But God said, what if I invite you to do this podcast for the rest of your life? And however many decades from now, nobody listens to it, right? Are you willing to still be obedient to my call, even though it looks like a failure? And maybe I'll say, oh, yeah, sure, God. And God's like, all right, but what if, not only that, but everyone looks at you like a joke? This guy, Paul, lost his job, and then he went and started doing podcasts and writing books, and nobody listened to his podcast. Nobody read his books. Like, he's probably just sitting around. He's lazy. And he's probably lazy. He just doesn't want to work. That's probably what it is. And man, he wasted time. And what if people look down on you, Paul, but then you get into eternity and I say, well done, my good and faithful servant? Is that, like, would that be enough? Or do you need the treasure on earth? Right? It's talking about storing treasures in heaven. Anybody who gets their acclaim on earth, like scripture said, well, they got their reward.
Right.
But what we recognize is there's something greater, but it's the acknowledgement that, are we willing to die to everything else? Are we willing to be made to look like fools if it's so that God is brought glory and so that he is made known? Because at the end of the day, like, what we recognize is, like, what are our lives? It's like a blip on the eternal radar. It can sound daunting, especially if somebody's in the midst of it, like, oh my gosh, why would you be a Christian? That sounds like a miserable life. But I can tell you, like, there are hard moments, yes, but as you noted earlier, those were going to happen anyways. Like, there's not a single person on earth that doesn't experience hardship. This is a broken world, and we're broken people, and there's this, like, it's just going to be hardship. But there is a peace, a contentment, a joy that is continuously being grown within me that makes me confident that no matter what happens. When the Apostle Paul said, be content in every situation, he had experienced worse than I have. Not just, like, misrepresented, and not just having opportunities taken from him, but being beaten and flogged and imprisoned and shipwrecked. Like, and he's like, yep, I would choose this life. And this is a guy who had the successful life on lock. He was the Pharisee of Pharisees, the Hebrew of Hebrews. If he had just kept going, he would have been known worldwide for all time, maybe, as like, oh man, the Apostle Paul, or not the Apostle, Saul the Pharisee. Like, but he was like, what he when he thinks about that, he says, oh yeah, no, all that's rubbish. Like, compared to Christ, like I can see now that that is actually legitimately garbage. And I understand why it seems valuable to you, because it was valuable to me, but it cannot compare to what Jesus showed me. And this is what people miss if they don't know Jesus at that level. This is why people can have foolish lives where they look like failures, because we're like, oh no, all the stuff you think that I should have, like that looks like trash compared to Jesus. Like, I don't need it anymore. I don't want it anymore. And that resolve can grow and grow and grow. Like the Apostle Paul said that you noted, like, not that I've achieved perfection, but I continue to run the race. We just keep on growing in this understanding until we get to eternity and we actually fully see it. Now we see as in a mirror dimly, but we'll fully see. And it's like, okay, I wasn't crazy.
Right.
Human success wasn't the goal, would never have accomplished it. Like I can see now that what God is offering, this full life, really is more than enough and abundantly more than I could ask or imagine.
Yes. That was great. I have nothing to add to that. I have absolutely nothing to add to that. That was awesome. So I want to ask this question. I ask everyone this question. What do you believe is your purpose, and how did you accept it?
Yeah. That's a hard one too, right? Because we feel like purpose has to be very clear. You talked about making the plan. Like,
right.
We got to be able to name and clarify what that is. I am a lawyer. I'm a doctor. I'm a pastor. I mean, Scripture is filled with people whose roles changed, like the human roles, but their functional purpose. Like my core purpose, yours as well, most of the people listening as well, is to love God and love others. Like that's what we are created for. We are made in the image of God, and Scripture says that God is love. So we are made in the image of love. Therefore, like love is core to who we are and how we're meant to function, how we were designed to function. And how that plays out looks a little different for each person, depending on their circumstances, their personality, the spiritual gifts that God's given them, the functional gifts that God's given them. And where I see that playing out for me, and it's been honed over time, is to create authentic, accessible spaces. So yes, I am a podcaster, not because I want to be, but because I recognized, I think this is a way that God wants me to create authentic, accessible spaces that me and someone else can process God in a real way. Yes. Can ask the hard questions, can not have to solve everything. I will sit with friends or neighbors or whoever on my porch and have deep conversation, right? It's not about, I'm providing pastoral care. It's God has called me to create authentic, accessible space. And so I can look back in my life and see the threads of that. Times where I was thinking about it when you were talking about people coming up to you and just start telling their life stories. Like, that was the same thing. Like, I'm an introvert. I don't want small talk. But even as far back as like in middle school, I can remember people always like telling me things. And I remember there being points where I'm like, why do I have a sign on me? Like, I don't understand. But now I can look back and realize, because it wasn't me. It was something that God had put within me that wasn't about me, but it was about how he was presenting himself, because I'm an ambassador of Christ. So in some way, I'm supposed to be portraying God. We think it's in what we talk and what we do, but sometimes it's not about us at all. It's God's, like, he takes our body and conveys himself. And sometimes we don't even catch it. And someone else is like, oh man, I saw God in you in that way. I was like, oh, I didn't even realize. And so that's my purpose. And I came to accept it the more I was able to release my own expectations and the world's expectations, right? Like, okay, God, I'll create this podcast, but okay, am I willing for it to look like a failure and for people to mock me? Okay, God, I'll write these books, but it's not about becoming a world-renowned author or getting sustainable income from it. Like, what if nobody reads it? Is faithfulness to God to put fingers to keyboard enough? When I released all those expectations and I could realize, like, that authentic, accessible space, it's not about me getting credit or having the skills. That puts me in a position like the Apostle Paul, who poured himself out for these cities And then some of them would turn around and say, oh, Paul? No, I follow Apollos. Apollos came after, right? So like Paul could have gotten mad, like, no, I'm the one who taught you that, not Apollo. Come on. Like, but he relates it because he's like, who is Apollos and who is Paul? I plant the seed, Apollos waters it, but God's the one that makes it grow. And so the more I release that I'm the one that's growing the stuff, and I'm able to just have a peace that like, I might just put a seed and nobody ever knows that I did it, but I was faithful because God put the seed in my hand and I just dropped it. Like, and that's my role. And that's actually something that God says, well done, my good and faithful servant. It helps me accept it. I'm still human. So I still have moments where I was like, I don't think anybody's buying my book. Or, I still had those moments.
Right.
But I'm learning to release those because we desire to be accepted and appreciated. But sometimes the reason that's so hard is because God's acceptance and appreciation isn't enough for us in our minds. And so I'm learning to trust how God sees me, even if everyone sees me the opposite.
That's awesome. I love that. I love that. Thank you so much, Pastor Paul, for joining us today. I really appreciate you stopping by to talk to the people and make sure they have an understanding, a deeper understanding of perseverance and fighting through those hard times and relying on God. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you for the opportunity to share. And what I want to encourage people is it all starts with one simple, small step. So don't look at either of us or anybody else and say, well, they're more spiritual than I am. No, we're not. Like, it's again, like it's that simple step off the bungee platform. Like no matter who you are in your situation, you don't have to be strong enough, wise enough, spiritual enough, anything enough other than just willing to take that step. So I encourage you to take a singular small step, start there, toe nudge forward, and then you'll take another and another one. Over time, it'll build. But God is seeking you. He is present with you. And it says, seeking you will find. Just start that little journey today in a small way and then keep an eye out.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for hanging out with us today on the Who God Says podcast with your host and Kingdom Ambassador, Ty Chandra. Go to whogodsays.com to join the mailing list for episode premieres, upcoming guests, and more. Send in your questions to be a part of the show at whogodsays@gmail.com. And don't forget, join the Kingdom Fanatic community. Until next time, be blessed and also be a blessing.